The crisp morning air of September 28th carried the scent of burning leaves through the streets of Ridgemont, a picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where neighbors still knew each other's names, where front doors remained unlocked, and where violent crime was something that happened in other places, to other people. That illusion of safety was about to be violently torn apart. Margaret Chen had lived on Oakwood Drive for 43 years. At 61, she had become a beloved fixture in the community, known for her tireless volunteer work at the local library, her award-winning rose garden, and her remarkable ability to remember the names and birthdays of every child in the neighborhood. A retired elementary school principal, she had devoted her life to education and community service, building a legacy of kindness that touched hundreds of lives across 4 decades. Her small Victorian home, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, was a landmark on the quiet residential street. She had raised 2 daughters there, watched them graduate college, get married, and give her 4 grandchildren who were the light of her life. At an age when most people were slowing down, Margaret Chen was still vibrant, still engaged, still contributing. She had just been elected president of the Ridgemont Historical Society and was planning the town's bicentennial celebration. Her calendar was full. Her future was bright. She had no way of knowing that future would be measured in hours, not years. The evening of September 27th was unremarkable in every way. Margaret had spent the day at the library, organizing a book drive for underprivileged children. She returned home around 6 o'clock, waved to her neighbor Mrs. Patterson across the street, and went inside to prepare her simple dinner of soup and salad. The last person to speak with her was her daughter, Rebecca, who called at 7:30 to discuss plans for an upcoming family gathering. Their conversation was warm, filled with laughter about Rebecca's youngest child's antics at preschool. They said, "I love you," before hanging up, neither knowing those would be Margaret's last words to her daughter. The attack occurred sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock that evening. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle outside the house. Everything about the exterior of the house appeared normal, peaceful, undisturbed. But inside, a scene of incomprehensible violence had unfolded. When Margaret's body was discovered the following morning by her daughter, who had come by to drop off some photographs from a recent family dinner, the peaceful narrative of Ridgemont was shattered forever. Rebecca's screams brought neighbors running. Mrs. Patterson, who had seen Margaret just hours before, stood frozen on the front lawn, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. The police arrived within minutes of the frantic 911 call, but it was far too late. Margaret Chen, pillar of the community, beloved mother and grandmother, had been brutally murdered in her own home, her life stolen in an act of violence so savage and senseless that it would haunt the first responders for years to come. Detective Sarah Morrison of the Ridgemont Police Department was the lead investigator assigned to the case. A 15-year veteran with an impeccable solve rate, she had seen her share of violence, but nothing in her career had prepared her for the brutality of this crime scene. The attack had been frenzied, excessive, and utterly devoid of any rational motive. Margaret's purse sat on the kitchen table, her wallet inside containing $200 in cash. Her jewelry was untouched. Her television, computer, and other valuables remained in place. This was not a robbery. This was murder for the sake of murder. The forensic team worked through the morning and into the afternoon, documenting every detail of the scene. They found no signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds suggesting Margaret had time to fight back. The attack had been swift, brutal, and overwhelming. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been struck from behind, never seeing her attacker. Small mercies, Detective Morrison thought, though they provided little comfort to the family now destroyed by grief. The notification to Margaret's family was one of the hardest tasks Detective Morrison had ever performed. Sitting in a small, sterile room at the police station, she watched Rebecca Chen's world collapse in real time. The daughter's initial response was denial, insisting there must be some mistake, that her mother couldn't possibly be dead. But as the reality settled in, denial gave way to a grief so profound it seemed to physically hurt Morrison to witness. Rebecca's husband held her wife as she sobbed, while Morrison explained what little they knew, carefully omitting the worst details of the violence. "Who would do this?" Rebecca kept asking, her voice raw and broken. "Who could possibly want to hurt my mother? She never harmed anyone. She spent her whole life helping people. This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." Detective Morrison had no answers to give her. In her experience, most murders had clear motives: financial gain, personal vendetta, crimes of passion. But this case defied all conventional logic. Margaret Chen had no enemies. Her financial situation was stable but modest. She had no romantic entanglements. There were no disputes with neighbors, no conflicts at work, no debts, no secrets. She was exactly what she appeared to be: a good woman who had lived a good life. And someone had brutally ended it for no discernible reason. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Morrison and her team interviewed hundreds of people: neighbors, friends, colleagues from the library, members of the Historical Society, former students and teachers from Margaret's years as a principal. Every single person told the same story. Margaret Chen was universally loved: kind, generous, patient, thoughtful. Not a single person had a negative word to say about her. The absence of any potential suspect or motive was maddening. It was as if she had been killed by a ghost. The media descended on Ridgemont with though no formal psychological evaluation had ever been conducted. Kyle still lived with his parents in a modest ranch house on Elm Street. His father was a mechanic, his mother a part-time bookkeeper. They were hardworking, respectable people who seemed genuinely bewildered by the police's interest in their son. When Detective Morrison obtained a search warrant for the Brennan residence, both parents insisted there had been some mistake, that Kyle was a good boy who had never caused any real trouble. The arrest was executed at dawn on October 3rd, 6 days after Margaret Chen's murder. A tactical team surrounded the house as Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers approached the front door. Mr. Brennan answered in his bathrobe, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and disbelief as he read the warrant. Kyle was found in his bedroom, asleep, looking younger than his 19 years, almost innocent in his vulnerability. He woke slowly, disoriented, and for a moment Morrison saw a flash of fear in his eyes. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by something blank and unreadable. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice calm and eerily steady for someone being woken by armed police officers. "Yes," Morrison replied, reading him his rights as one of the officers handcuffed him. Kyle nodded slowly, as if this was an expected development, a natural progression of events. He offered no resistance, asked no questions, showed no emotion. As the officers led him out of the house, his mother screaming and sobbing behind him, Kyle looked back at her once, his expression completely neutral, before turning away and walking calmly to the patrol car. The search of Kyle's bedroom yielded evidence that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Forensic technicians found a pair of Nike sneakers at the back of his closet, their soles bearing microscopic traces of blood. DNA analysis would later confirm it was a perfect match to Margaret Chen. Hidden in a box under his bed was a hunting knife, recently cleaned, but showing residual traces of blood in the grooves of the handle. The serrated blade pattern matched wounds documented in the autopsy report with scientific precision. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was Kyle's laptop. The browser history revealed hundreds of searches related to violent crime. How to commit the perfect murder? Do security cameras work at night? How long does DNA last at a crime scene? His online activity showed an obsessive interest in serial killers and true crime cases. There were no specific searches about Margaret Chen, nothing that indicated he had targeted her specifically. It appeared he had simply chosen her at random, a crime of opportunity rather than premeditation, which somehow made it even more horrifying. The interrogation began that afternoon in a small room at the Ridgemont Police Department. Kyle sat across from Detective Morrison and her partner, Detective James Torres, his posture relaxed, almost casual. His parents had retained a lawyer, but Kyle waived his right to have the attorney present, much to everyone's surprise. He seemed eager to talk, confident in his ability to control the narrative, a fatal miscalculation that would doom him. "I know why I'm here," Kyle said before Morrison could even begin her questions. You think I killed that old lady? Margaret Chen, Morrison corrected. Her name was Margaret Chen. And did you kill her, Kyle? He smiled then, a small, secretive smile that made Morrison's skin crawl. What do you think? I think you should tell me the truth. The truth, Kyle repeated, leaning back in his chair. The truth is complicated, Detective. See, I didn't plan to kill anyone that night. I was just walking around, bored. I saw her house, saw a window was partially open in the back. I thought maybe I'd look around, see if there was anything interesting inside. So you broke into Margaret Chen's home, Torres interjected. I didn't break anything, Kyle corrected, his tone pedantic. The window was open. I just climbed through. It's not really breaking and entering if nothing gets broken, right? Morrison exchanged a glance with Torres. The casual way Kyle was describing his actions, as if this were a minor technicality rather than a serious crime, was deeply unsettling. What happened once you were inside? Morrison asked. He shrugged. She heard me, came into the room, started yelling, saying she was going to call the police. I couldn't let that happen. So you killed her, Morrison stated flatly. I stopped her from calling the police, Kyle corrected, his voice taking on an annoyed edge, as if Morrison was deliberately misunderstanding him. It wasn't personal. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You stabbed her 14 times, Kyle. That sounds pretty personal to me. He considered this for a moment, tilting his head like a bird examining something curious. I wanted to make sure she couldn't call anyone. I had to be thorough. Response, whether it was justification, anger, or even twisted pride. But Kyle Brennan showed nothing. He was describing the murder of Margaret Chen the same way someone might describe changing a tire, a minor inconvenience, a problem that needed solving, a task that had been completed with reasonable efficiency. Did you know Margaret Chen before that night? Torres asked. No, never seen her before. So you killed a complete stranger, a 61-year-old woman who never did anything to you. She was going to call the police, Kyle repeated, as if this were obvious and sufficient justification. What else was I supposed to do? You were supposed to leave, Morrison said, her voice tight with controlled anger. You were supposed to not break into someone's home. You were supposed to act like a human being with a conscience. Kyle's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. A conscience, he repeated. Is that what you think is missing? Maybe you're right, Detective. Maybe I just don't feel things the way you do. Maybe I never did. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and will become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Kyle Brennan had admitted to breaking into Margaret Chen's home and killing her, displaying not a shred of remorse or empathy for his victim. As the interrogation concluded and Kyle was led to a holding cell, Detective Morrison sat in the observation room, staring at the now empty chair where the killer had sat, trying to understand the empty void she had just witnessed. Part 2. The Legal Machine. The Franklin County District Attorney's Office assigned the case to senior prosecutor Daniel Vasquez, a 38-year-old attorney with a reputation for meticulous preparation and courtroom effectiveness. Vasquez had prosecuted over 200 cases in his 15-year career with an impressive conviction rate. But as he reviewed the Margaret Chen murder file, he felt a familiar combination of professional determination and personal disgust. This was the kind of case that reminded him why he had become a prosecutor: to remove dangerous people from society and seek justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The evidence against Kyle Brennan was overwhelming. They had his confession, the physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, his browser history showing premeditation and planning, and eyewitness testimony placing him in the area at the time of the murder.
This should have been a straightforward prosecution, an easy conviction. But Vasquez knew from experience that nothing was ever truly simple when it came to the criminal justice system, especially when the defendant was young and could potentially be portrayed as misguided or mentally ill rather than evil. His first major decision was whether to charge Kyle Brennan as a juvenile or as an adult. At 19, Kyle was technically an adult, but his defense attorney would almost certainly argue for leniency based on his age and brain development. Vasquez spent hours reviewing case law, consulting with colleagues, and considering the implications. In the end, the decision was clear. The brutality of the crime, the lack of remorse, and the danger Kyle posed to the public demanded he be tried as an adult and face the full consequences of his actions. The preliminary hearing was held on October 15th, less than 3 weeks after Margaret Chen's murder. The courtroom was packed with media, community members, and Margaret's grieving family. Rebecca sat in the front row, flanked by her husband and her sister, all three wearing photographs of Margaret pinned to their clothing. Behind them sat Margaret's colleagues from the library, members of the Historical Society, former students, and friends. Their collective grief was palpable, a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Kyle was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked small and young, almost vulnerable, and Vasquez knew that would be exactly the image his defense attorney would try to cultivate. But when Kyle's eyes scanned the courtroom, there was nothing vulnerable in his gaze. There was curiosity, a hint of satisfaction at the attention, and that same disturbing emptiness Detective Morrison had noted in the interrogation room. Kyle's defense attorney was Thomas Garrett, a public defender in his early 50s, with graying hair and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much human tragedy. Garrett was competent, experienced, and ethical, but he had been handed an almost impossible case. His client had confessed, the evidence was overwhelming, and Kyle himself seemed determined to make his attorney's job as difficult as possible with his complete lack of appropriate emotional response. During the preliminary hearing, Judge Patricia Hartwell reviewed the charges: first-degree murder, breaking and entering, and weapons violations.
Kyle to accept a plea deal. Vasquez had offered 25 years to life, which would make Kyle eligible for parole when he was in his mid-40s. It was more lenient than Kyle deserved, but it would spare Margaret's family the trauma of a trial and guarantee a lengthy sentence. Garrett presented the offer to Kyle, explaining that if they went to trial and lost, which was almost certain, he would face life without parole. Kyle barely considered it. "No," he said flatly, "I want to go to trial. I want to tell my story." "This isn't about telling your story," Garrett said, frustration creeping into his voice. "This is about your life. Do you understand that if we go to trial, you will almost certainly spend the rest of your life in prison?" "Then I guess we'll see what happens," Kyle replied, that disturbing half-smile playing at his lips. Garrett reported back to the judge that his client had rejected the plea offer. Judge Hartwell set the trial to begin the following Monday. As Garrett left the courthouse that evening, he called his wife and told her he'd be working late for the next few weeks. He didn't mention that he was about to defend a client he knew was guilty, knew was dangerous, and knew would probably sabotage his own defense. Some burdens were too heavy to share, even with the people you loved most. Part 3. The trial begins. Monday, November 16th, dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood of Ridgemont. The Franklin County Courthouse, a stately building of gray stone and classical columns, was surrounded by news vans and reporters. The murder of Margaret Chen had captured regional attention, and the trial was being covered by major news outlets across Pennsylvania and beyond. Security was tight, with additional deputies stationed throughout the building to manage the crowds and maintain order. Inside Courtroom 3, the atmosphere was tense and expectant. The prosecution table was occupied by Daniel Vasquez and his junior attorney, Michelle Kim, a sharp young prosecutor who had been invaluable in preparing the case. At the defense table sat Thomas Garrett and his paralegal,
both wearing the grim expressions of soldiers about to enter a battle they knew they couldn't win. And between them, in an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his father, sat Kyle Brennan, looking around the courtroom with undisguised curiosity. The gallery was filled with spectators, media representatives, and Margaret Chen's family. Rebecca sat in the front row, flanked by her husband and her sister, all three wearing photographs of Margaret pinned to their clothing. Behind them sat Margaret's colleagues from the library, members of the Historical Society, former students and friends. Their collective grief was palpable, a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Jury selection had taken 3 full days. Vasquez had carefully vetted each potential juror, looking for people who could handle the emotional weight of the case while remaining objective. He wanted people who valued hard evidence, who wouldn't be swayed by defense manipulation, and who could look at a 19-year-old defendant and still see him as accountable for his actions. Garrett, meanwhile, had sought out anyone who might harbor sympathy for a young person, anyone who believed in rehabilitation over punishment, anyone who might be persuaded by his argument of diminished capacity. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 66. They represented a cross-section of the community: a retired teacher, a factory worker, a small business owner, a nurse, an accountant, and others. They had all sworn they could be impartial, that they could set aside whatever they had heard or read about the case and render a verdict based solely on the evidence presented in court. Now they sat in the jury box, their faces serious and attentive, aware of the weight of responsibility they carried. Judge Patricia Hartwell entered the courtroom and everyone rose. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation as a nonsense judge who ran an efficient courtroom and tolerated neither incompetence nor theatrical grandstanding from attorneys. She took her seat, surveyed the courtroom, and called the proceedings to order. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "We are here for the trial of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Kyle Brennan. Before we begin with opening statements, I want to remind everyone in this courtroom that we will conduct ourselves with dignity and respect. This is a court of law, not a theater. Any outbursts, any disruptions will result in immediate removal from the courtroom. Is that understood?" A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the gallery. "Mr. Vasquez," Judge Hartwell continued, "you may proceed with your opening statement." Daniel Vasquez rose and approached the jury box.
A condition that affects his ability to feel empathy, to understand the emotional impact of his actions, to connect with other people in meaningful ways. Garrett's strategy was becoming clear. Kyle Brennan's brain doesn't work the way yours does, the way mine does. He processes the world differently. When he broke into Margaret Chen's home that night, he wasn't thinking about the person he might encounter. He wasn't considering the family that would be destroyed. He literally couldn't think that way because his brain is structured differently. He walked along the jury box, his expression earnest. "I know it's difficult to understand. How can someone not feel empathy? How can someone not feel remorse? But these are questions we must grapple with as a society. Kyle Brennan is the product of a serious mental illness, one that affects millions of people in this country. That doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing can excuse taking an innocent life. But it does explain it, and that explanation matters when we consider questions of culpability and punishment." Garrett continued, building his argument that Kyle's psychological condition made him less than fully responsible for his actions, that he should be treated as mentally ill rather than evil. It was a well-crafted opening, delivered with conviction and skill. But as he spoke, Kyle sat at the defense table with a faint smile playing at his lips, looking almost pleased with the attention, completely disconnected from the gravity of what was being discussed. Several jurors noticed this disconnect. They watched Kyle's reactions, or lack thereof, with growing unease. Here was his lawyer arguing that he was mentally ill, incapable of normal emotional response, and Kyle looked like he was enjoying the show. It was a preview of what would become the defining characteristic of the entire trial. The prosecution building a case brick by brick, and the defendant himself being the most damaging evidence against his own defense.